Every time I looked at her, a fire began to grow in my chest. Barbara was a real woman, one who knew how to control herself and those around her. She knew how to influence a man, and I was no exception. Betty could yell at me all she wanted and take out her frustration on me, but her mother, she was different. There was a fire in her eyes that I couldn't ignore. And then one day when she came closer to me than usual, I realized there was no turning back.
Thank you for watching my channel. I create videos for your enjoyment. Please subscribe if you want to support my efforts, it's very important to me. I apologize in advance for any mistakes, dubbing is done by neural network. Please point out mistakes in the comments so I can correct them.
Alex sat on the old leather couch in Barbara's apartment, waiting for her to finish talking on the phone. He never thought he'd be here in her house, so close to her. The room was lightly scented with her perfume, sweet, with notes of vanilla and jasmine. Alex had long ago noticed how Barbara began to play a dangerous game with him, as if she didn't notice her daughter's presence. She would casually touch his hand as she passed by, and her long nails would lightly scratch his skin, causing an involuntary rush of arousal. Each time these accidents became more and more explicit. Barbara was the epitome of femininity. Her lush hair fell on her shoulders in soft waves, her face was without a single wrinkle, and her figure, in spite of her age, was strikingly trim. She knew how to emphasize her shape. The tight dress tightly covered her breasts, raising them slightly and leaving a small cleavage that was hard to look away from. Barbara walked over to Alex with a glass of wine in her hand and sat down across from him and took a long sip, keeping her eyes on him. "Tired?" she asked, her voice sounding soft but with an undercurrent of irony in it. Her gaze slid down his face and then lingered on his lips. Alex looked at her, swallowing. He realized where this was going, but he was afraid to admit even to himself that this was the moment he wanted the most. He could feel the tension in the room building. Barbara took another slow sip of wine, then set the glass on the table and suddenly ran her hand down his neck as if hinting at something more. "You know, Alex, life is too short to waste it on empty arguments and grievances." Her voice was deep, almost velvety, and the words seemed to be a poison that penetrated his mind, making him forget everything else. Barbara moved closer, and at that moment Alex felt his will begin to weaken. She leaned toward him, so close that he felt her breath on his cheek. Alex knew that Betty could come back at any moment, but at that moment it didn't bother him. Barbara took her time, as if she were playing her own game in which Alex was only a pawn. Her hand slid slowly down his shoulder, then she ran her fingers along his neck, leaving a hot trail behind her. Alex held his breath. Each of her touches felt cold and scalding at the same time, and at the same time, everything inside him quivered. She seemed to know every nerve he had, every vulnerable point, and played with them like a cat with a mouse. "You can feel it, can't you?" Her voice was barely audible, but it penetrated to the very depths of his mind, shattering the remnants of his composure. She smiled, watching his confusion. "Why don't we talk frankly, Alex? I see the way you look at me. How long are you going to hide your desires?" He tried to rise from the couch, but Barbara put her hand on his chest, gently but insistently, forcing him to stay where he was. His heart was pounding so hard it seemed the whole house could hear its beat. He wanted to leave, but it was as if his body was paralyzed by her presence. "You know Betty is just a baby," Barbara continued, her fingers running lightly over his collarbone. "She doesn't understand you the way I might. How many times has she yelled at you? How many times has she reproached you for not being good enough for her?" Alex was silent. Her words hit exactly the target, as if they exposed all his hidden resentments and frustrations. He was really tired of Betty's constant whims. Every day they quarreled over money, or over the smallest things in life. Betty demanded more and more, as if his efforts were never enough for her. Barbara, on the other hand, was always friendly and caring. "I've seen the way she looks at you," Barbara continued. "She always doesn't like something. But you deserve better than that, Alex, don't you? Deserve a woman who understands you, who sees you as a man." Her fingers now slid down his cheek and then gently touched his lips. At that moment Alex felt his last defense crumble. He caught her hand and pressed it to his lips, smelling her perfume, sweet and intoxicating. His mind screamed that this was a mistake, that things would go too far, but Barbara was already subjugating his every thought. "No one will know, Alex," she whispered, leaning even closer to him. Her lips were a centimeter away from his, and he couldn't resist any longer. Everything inside him was boiling with desire, but it wasn't just passion for Barbara, it was something more. It was the temptation of the forbidden, the desire to avenge Betty for all her reproaches and humiliations. He drew Barbara to him, their lips locked, and at that moment the world around them disappeared. Nothing seemed to exist but that kiss. It was long, warm, and full of forbidden passion. Alex couldn't hold back any longer. Everything that had been building up inside of him came out. But even at that moment he knew there was no turning back. Barbara continued to cross Alex's mind, even when he was near Betty. The image of her, a mature, confident woman who knew what she wanted, had haunted him, never letting go. Each of their encounters grew more daring, and Alex couldn't deny that he was getting used to this forbidden connection. He wasn't coming back to Barbara because there was love between them. It was something else, pure, unencumbered passion. She was his girlfriend's mother, but that only fueled his desires. One day, when Betty had gone to a friend's house again for the weekend, Alex realized he had an opportunity. Barbara, as if reading his mind, called him first. "Are you alone?" Her voice was low, playful, and Alex already knew how this conversation was going to end. "Yes," he answered briefly, realizing there was nowhere to retreat to. "Come to my place. I have a surprise for you." When Alex arrived, Barbara was already waiting for him at the door, dressed in a short robe that barely clung to her shoulders. In that moment, he realized again how much older she was than he was. But this maturity did not deter him. On the contrary, it was becoming Barbara's most attractive feature. She knew how to behave with a man, how to give pleasure, and most importantly, there was no commitment between them. "You look tense," she purred, wrapping her arms around his neck. "How about I help you relax?" Alex silently pulled her to him. He could feel her warmth, her mature body that didn't compare to young girls like Betty. Barbara was an experienced woman who knew how to control a man, and Alex couldn't resist her charms. They were in the bedroom faster than he could have realized. Barbara, wasting no time, dropped her robe to the floor. Her body, mature, well-groomed, with large breasts that Betty sorely lacked, made him forget everything. He knew he shouldn't do this, but he came back to her every time because she gave him what Betty couldn't, real adult passion. "You realize it's only a game, don't you?" she whispered again as they merged in an embrace. "There's nothing between us but this. I need you for good sex, Alex, and you're doing a great job." Alex only responded with a passionate kiss, surrendering to her attraction again and again. There was no thought of love or the future between them. Barbara knew that at her age she couldn't expect a long relationship with a young guy. Alex, on the other hand, was completely subservient to her mature attraction. He was only a toy for her, and she was the embodiment of her most forbidden desires for him. Every time they met was like a dangerous game. They knew they were taking a risk, but that risk only fueled the fire of passion. Barbara was older, much older, but she used her age to her advantage. Her movements were confident, every touch was deliberate, every word precise. And Alex became more and more convinced that Betty would never be able to give him what her mother gave him. They didn't talk about feelings. Feelings were unnecessary. It came down to one thing: they both got what they wanted every time. Intimacy with Barbara was Alex's release, his escape from a world where he was constantly rebuked and nagged by Betty. Alex couldn't escape the thought of Barbara, even when Betty was around. Her delicate lines and confident movements haunted him. Every time he looked at Betty, his mind involuntarily returned to the image of her mother. Barbara was not just a beautiful woman, she was the epitome of femininity, maturity, and unconditional attraction. When Alex arrived at Barbara's house again, he was ready for what awaited him. She opened the door, and when he saw her, he knew he was ready to drown in her arms again. The robe she wore was modest, but Alex realized that even in it she looked divine. She had long manicured legs that seemed endless as she strutted toward him. Barbara wore her shape proudly, which only became more attractive with age. She had large breasts that looked like they were ready to burst out of the fabric of her robe at any moment, and it drove Alex crazy. "Come in, I've prepared something special," she said. Her voice was soft, but you could hear the strain of desire in it. She ran her fingers over his cheek, and he couldn't resist her charm. Barbara, much older than him, was keenly aware of her attractiveness and used it. Her confidence was mesmerizing, and Alex felt the passion flaring up inside him again. He stepped into the house and she slammed the door behind him, laughing, as if locking them into this small, intimate world. Barbara stepped closer to him, unhurriedly spread her robe, exposing her body, and the gesture was full of seduction. Her skin glistened like marble, and in the light of the lamp her form seemed even more perfect. The corners of Barbara's lips lifted in an enigmatic smile as she noticed the way Alex was looking at her, full of desire. "You do realize that I can give you something your girlfriend can never have," she whispered, looking into his eyes. She knew how to set his imagination on fire, and he could no longer think about the fact that there was no love between them. Alex moved closer, his hands trembling with lust as he touched her waist. Barbara, older, experienced, made him forget everything. Every look she gave him, every movement fueled the flames of his passion. She was a woman who knew how to satisfy a man. She reached for him, touching his lips with hers, and that kiss was insanely passionate. Alex felt her tongue dancing with his, and the attraction grew stronger with every second. Barbara was a true art of seduction, and he couldn't resist her charms. "Can you imagine what it would be like to be with me?" she asked as they pulled away from each other. Her voice was like an emanation of energy, and he could feel her taking him into her world. "Yes," he answered, and it was true. He longed for her, longed for these moments when he could be with her, when she could be only his. He embraced her, feeling her softness, the warmth that came from her body. Barbara, older than him, knew what she was doing. She pulled him with her into the bedroom where the soft light caressed her body. Alex followed her, unable to take his eyes off her. She looked mesmerizing, and every step she took was full of confidence and seduction. When they were in the bedroom, Barbara threw off her robe and stood naked in front of him like a challenge. Her body was a perfect shape that he studied with his own eyes. Alex couldn't believe that he was being embraced by such a woman, that she had chosen him, a young boy, to quench her desires. "Now I'm going to show you what true pleasure is," she uttered, her voice full of promise. She stepped closer and he felt his heart beat faster. All he needed was her. Every touch from Barbara was a revelation to Alex. She knew how to bring him to a state of total bliss. Her hands explored his body, opening up new sensations he had never experienced with Betty. He could feel her absorbing his desire, becoming the source of his pleasure herself. Barbara was a mature woman who knew how to fulfill all his needs without expecting anything in return. She wasn't his girlfriend. She was his girlfriend's mother, and that added fire to their bond. Every time they were together, Alex realized that only here in her arms could he be free, where no one and nothing would interfere with them. They were merging together, and this was just the beginning of their crazy adventure, in which there was no room for feelings, but a lot of passion and pleasure. Betty continued to be jealous and nag Alex as she did every day. Her temper, her endless whims and reproaches became unbearable for him. Always dissatisfied, she often quarreled with him over nothing, and every time they clashed, Alex realized that communication with her was becoming more and more exhausting. "Why didn't you answer my call?" she asked grudgingly, flashing her eyes. "You've been hanging around somewhere again, haven't you? Don't you need me?" She kept asking him questions that left him no chance to justify himself. At times like this, Alex caught himself thinking that his thoughts were slipping away to Barbara. In her arms he felt like a real man, not messing with Betty's constant whims. Every time she began her next monologue about how dissatisfied she was with life and him, he wished he were with Barbara, her grown-up, passionate and liberated. "You're not listening to me." Betty exploded again, raising her voice. But Alex would just stare out the window at that moment, imagining Barbara waiting for him in her apartment, her body craving his touch. When Alex found himself with Barbara, all tension disappeared. She wasn't a girl who demanded attention and endlessly asked questions. Barbara was a woman who knew what she wanted, and Alex realized he could just be himself without taking responsibility for her emotions. Each time they met, he came to each meeting as if he was in a land where no annoying questions or recriminations existed. Barbara enveloped him, immersing him in a world of sensual pleasures. She was able to turn his every fear into desire, every second into eternity. Barbara always knew how to seduce him. She would walk up to him, her eyes full of fire and her hands gently touching his body, and it was so intense that Alex forgot about everything, even the fact that she was his girlfriend's mother. Every time they met, she started with a kiss that could burn him, and Alex, forgetting everything, reacted to her as if they were the only people on earth. His thoughts of Barbara became more and more frequent and his interactions with Betty more and more unbearable. Memories of her whims, of her nagging him for every little thing, only made him more eager. Every time he heard her voice, he remembered Barbara whispering softly in his ear, sending shivers throughout his body. Once again when Betty made a scene, Alex decided he didn't want any more of this. She didn't realize that her constant rebukes were pushing him away. "You can't talk to me like that," he tried to explain, but her words only corroded his nerves. At that moment, all that came into his mind were images of Barbara, her body, her touch. When he found himself back at Barbara's house, she greeted him with a warmth and understanding that he sorely lacked around Betty. "You came." Her voice sounded like she was happy to see him. Her smile chased away all his doubts. "Come on, I know how tired you are," she pronounced, leading him over to the couch. Alex stared at her, unable to look away. She was completely different from Betty. Confident, mature, she knew how to relax him, how to make him forget all his worries. When she touched him, he felt every part of her crave him. Alex couldn't help but think about how well she managed to create an atmosphere of intimacy and comfort. Barbara pressed herself against him again, and he felt her breasts touch his chest. Every time they met, his desire grew to a fever pitch. He gently ran his hand around her waist, feeling her body respond to his touch. She, compared to Betty, was the true embodiment of femininity and strength. Alex kept realizing that there was no love between them, only passion. She wasn't seeking anything from him but physical intimacy, and that was completely in line with his desires. They could forget about the world and their worries and just be with each other. Every time Barbara laughed, every time her lips gently touched his, he realized he was drifting away into her arms, leaving all his worries behind. With each new moment with Barbara, he realized more and more how his life with Betty had become a burden. Her whims, her rebukes, her constant arguments, all of it became less and less important compared to the passion he felt around Barbara. Her maturity and confidence only emphasized his youth and inexperience, making their connection more intriguing and forbidden. Once it was just the two of them, Alex felt free. He could be who he really was, a man hungry for pleasure, unencumbered by relationships that overwhelmed him. All he needed was Barbara, her body and the heat she brought to his life. Betty was home alone, her thoughts revisiting her recent quarrel with Alex. Her endless whims and rebukes were not having the desired effect, and she was thinking more and more often that maybe there was something wrong with their relationship. But she was stubborn, and it seemed to her that everything would be all right if she would only take more care and attention from him. On one of those days when Betty was expecting Alexa, she decided to go to her mom's house. They hadn't talked that often, and she wanted to see Barbara, to see how she was doing. Betty gathered her thoughts, quickly threw on her jacket and left the house, not realizing that her life would change forever. As she approached her mother's apartment, her heart pounded in anticipation. Betty knocked on the door and, receiving an answer, opened it. The apartment was quiet and she walked toward the kitchen, but as she passed the door to the bedroom, quiet sounds caught her attention. What could it be? She muttered to herself, stopping at the door. She listened and suddenly realized she could hear Alex's familiar voice. "No, this can't be," she thought, fumbling for the doorknob. Gathering all her resolve, she opened the door. Inside she saw a picture that shocked her. Alex and Barbara were lying naked on the bed. Alex was pleasuring her mother and she was moaning, telling him not to stop, that she was almost at her peak. In that instant, the world crumbled for Betty. All her fears, insecurities, and crankiness became empty when she saw that scene. She froze in place, unable to believe what was happening, her heart racing and her mind filled with anger and betrayal. "What are you doing?" She screamed, unable to hold back. Her voice echoed through the apartment, and Alex, startled, turned around instantly. He stared at Betty in horror, and Barbara, as if caught off guard, quickly covered herself with a sheet. "Betty, wait, it's not what you think." Alexa tried to justify himself, but his words sounded useless. "It's not what I think it is. You're lying with my mother." Her voice shook with anger and pain. "How could you?" Barbara, still trying to cover herself, uttered, "Daughter, I..." "Shut up. You betrayed me." Betty interrupted her, looking at her mother with a hatred and resentment she had never felt before. She felt the storm rising within her and ran out of the room, severing ties with what she held dear. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she ran out of the apartment. She couldn't understand how this had happened, how her world could turn so quickly. All the moments she had spent with Alex, all the dreams of the future, had collapsed like a house of cards. Betty ran down the stairs without looking back. Her heart was bursting with rage, with betrayal, and she knew it wasn't just cheating. It was more. It was a broken bond that would never be repaired. Not only had she lost her boyfriend, but she had lost her mother, who had chosen her betrayer. Outside, the cold wind hit her face, but but she felt nothing but inner desolation and burning anger. She had no strength to contain her emotions. She knew that her life would be different now, and that change was inevitable. Betty ran out of the apartment, her heart pounding like a frenzy. Anger filled every cell in her body, and she didn't know where to go. But soon, gathering her thoughts, she returned to the door, determined to find out everything. When she opened the door again, Barbara and Alex were already dressed. The mother, noticing her daughter had returned, tried to look confident, but Betty could see her hand shaking as she fixed her hair. "Did you come back to throw another tantrum?" Barbara said sharply. Her voice was harsh, but you could see the fear in her eyes. "What are you talking about, Mom? How could you?" shouted Betty, her voice trembling with rage. "You betrayed me." Alex, not knowing how to act, took a step back. He looked at them anxiously, not understanding how it had happened that he had found himself in the center of this terrible conflict. "It's all your own fault, daughter," Barbara pronounced with cold determination, her eyes sparkling. "You're always nagging Alex, nagging him with your whims and reproaches. How could he not seek comfort?" Betty felt the blood rush to her face. She couldn't believe that her mother was judging her. "Are you serious? I've ruined a relationship? Is that what you think?" she screamed. "Yes, that's exactly what you think." Barbara stepped forward, her voice louder. "If you'd been more considerate of him, he wouldn't have gone off to someone else. It's not my fault you couldn't keep him around." Alex, not wanting to get involved in the conflict, tried to intervene. "Girls, please calm down. This isn't what we need right now." But Barbara interrupted him. "Go away, Alex. This is our business. We'll sort it out ourselves." "How can you say that? You're my mother and he's my boyfriend." Betty could feel the rage boiling up inside her. She looked to Alex for support, but instead ran into his silence. "I told you, you weren't worth it." Barbara continued, her voice growing more and more aggressive. "It's not like you were ever a good girlfriend for him, Betty. All you ever did was complain and whine. That's the result. He found comfort in me." Betty felt despair building up in her. "How can you say such things? You not only betrayed me, but you made me look guilty." Her voice became quieter, but the words still sounded like thunder. Alex, unable to stand the tension, said, "I didn't mean for this to happen. But there's always been too much conflict between you two." "Are you on her side too?" Betty asked, looking at him in disbelief. I just don't know how to fix it," he replied, his voice full of regret. "I didn't mean for all this to happen. I'm confused too." This statement only served to increase Betty's anger. "You have no right to say that. You were with my mother." "That's enough," Barbara shouted, breaking off the argument. "I'm not going to listen to any more of your whining. This is your problem, Betty. Alex chose me and you have to accept that." Betty looked at Alex, her heart clenched. She saw him nod slowly, as if agreeing with Barbara. The gesture burned her and she realized she was losing him. "You can't be so selfish as to not realize what you were doing." Barbara continued. "If you hadn't made Alex suffer, he wouldn't have sought solace elsewhere." Betty could hardly hold back her tears. She didn't want to see her mother or Alex. It was clear to her at that moment that their relationship would never be the same again. "If that's the case, I'm leaving," she uttered, her voice shaking with anger and pain. She wanted to run out to leave this place, but before she did, she turned to Alex. "You can stay with her if that's what you want. I won't bother you anymore." Alex, shocked, tried to say something, but Betty had already left. She couldn't take this humiliation any longer, couldn't stay in the place where she had been betrayed. As she left the apartment, Barbara turned to Alex. "You really should have realized that it was all her own fault," she pronounced, her voice full of confidence. Alex, already under pressure, got out of bed and slightly lost said, I'm not sure it was the right thing to do. I need to leave." "Where are you going to go?" Barbara asked with mild irritation, but her voice softened when she saw his expression. "I just don't want to be a part of it. I need to think about it," he uttered, turning to leave. "Don't you dare leave, Alex. You're mine, I won't let you leave." Barbara shouted, but he had already closed the door behind him, leaving her alone with her own decisions. Barbara was left alone in the room, looking at the empty space where Alex had just stood. She felt lost, But deep down she realized that the choices Alex had made could be the beginning of the end of her own relationship with her daughter. Betty walked down the street, her feet taking her far from home. Anger, resentment, and betrayal tormented her soul. She didn't understand how her mother could have done such a thing, or how Alex could have ended up with her. Finally, in the background of her feelings, there was one desire: to figure it all out, and get a break from this wild turmoil. Suddenly her phone rang, interrupting her train of thought. She looked at the screen and saw Alex's name. Her heart pounded harder. After everything that had happened, she wasn't sure she wanted to talk to him. But curiosity and the need for answers made her take the call. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "Betty, I'm sorry I scared you so much. I just wanted to tell you that I need to explain myself," Alex replied, his voice sounding tired and depressed. "Explain yourself? About what?" "About how you slept with my mother," she said sarcastically, feeling the anger boiling up inside her again. "I know it's horrible, but you have to realize for yourself what you did." His voice grew more and more insistent. "Your behavior has been intolerable, Betty. I didn't feel like a man around you. You were always complaining, throwing tantrums, and finally I found comfort where I could get it." Betty froze. She couldn't believe she was hearing such words. "So it's all my fault? You mean I made you cheat on me?" she asked, holding back tears. "In a way, yes," he continued. "I tried to do everything I could to make you happy, but you were only focused on your problems. When I saw your mother, she made me feel needed. She supported me, listened to me. I felt like I could be a man around her." Alex's words hit like a hammer, and she couldn't hold back her anger any longer. "You just turned your back on me and chose her. You betrayed me." "I didn't mean it." Alex sounded sincere. "But you know for yourself how hard it was. I wouldn't want to be in that situation. I hoped we could find a solution, but it didn't happen. I realize now that things between us can't be what they used to be." Betty felt rage building up in her. "You have no right to talk to me like that. You betrayed me, and now you're trying to twist things around so that it's my fault." "I'm just telling the truth." His voice turned cold. "You need to see what happened. You brought me to this point. And now that I've found what I was looking for, I can't turn back. I can't be with you anymore. I have to leave." Betty, seized by rage and a sense of betrayal, threw down. "Leave? Just like that? And all this to be with my mother? She betrayed me just as much as you did. I don't know how to explain it all, but I can't suffer anymore. I just can't. Please understand that." His voice shook with regret. Betty, feeling tears fill her eyes, said with difficulty, "I can't understand how you could do this. I thought you were someone who cared about me, and it turns out you just used me." Alex fell silent, and at that moment Betty felt an emptiness appear in her heart. "I don't know what to say. You've already made your decision, and I have to accept it," she said, trying to keep her pride intact. "I hope you find happiness," he said, and her heart squeezed at his words. "I'm very sorry. Goodbye, Betty." "Goodbye," she said, but her voice sounded like she was saying goodbye to a part of herself. She disconnected the call and, feeling empty and cheated, stopped in the street. Her life had changed in an instant, and she didn't know how to go on. She stood at the intersection, realizing that her world had turned upside down. Her mother, the one she had always shared secrets and plans with, now turned out to be the enemy. Alex, the guy she trusted, had betrayed her. In that second, she realized she could no longer go back to her old life. She had to find a new path. A few days after that ill-fated conversation, the whole town was shocked by the news. Alex and Barbara's connection had traveled every street, every yard, and as soon as someone saw them together and started the gossip, it instantly began to grow. It was in a small town where everyone knew each other, and the news that a 45-year-old woman was having an affair with her daughter's young boyfriend became a sensation. People jeered, discussed in whispers on street corners, gathering in small coffee shops to discuss the undignified relationship. It was said that Barbara had aged, but she still had that attraction that could drive a young man crazy. It was whispered behind her back that she used her beauty and experience to seduce Alex, while Betty herself had to cope with ridicule and reproach. Her friends pretended to be fine when they met her, but as soon as their faces blossomed into mocking smiles, Betty felt that all she could read in their eyes was pity and schadenfreude. "You always said Alex wasn't right for you, didn't you? He's too easy," one of her friends said, pretending to care about her feelings. He's with your mother now, so don't feel bad. Maybe he found what he was looking for. She continued with a smirk. The other girlfriends joined in the taunts, and soon the whole group was rolling with laughter. Meanwhile, Alex was enjoying unexpected popularity among his friends. When they found out about his new connection, they exclaimed that he was a real good guy. "You're a badass. This is a real win." They shouted, cheering him on. Alex, feeling on a horse, laughed along with them, not realizing that his choice had ruined the lives of two women. But at that moment it didn't matter to him. At one of his reunions with friends, Alex becomes the center of attention. He talks about his moments with Barbara, emphasizing her passion and experience. She knows what she wants, and it's wonderful. "I feel like a real man around her, not like I did with Betty, who was all about being cranky," he praises. Among the girls who knew Betty, word soon spread that she was simply insufferable. Well, how could she keep him away if she behaved like that herself? Poor Barbara just couldn't stand it, they said as they discussed what had happened. Betty felt the ground slipping from under her feet. Her own acquaintances never missed an opportunity to point out her faults, while her mother seemed suddenly to be a heroine. Every time Betty passed acquaintances, she felt their glances piercing her. The unpleasant words about how she had brought it on herself, or shown herself to be at her worst, sounded like blows. She couldn't take it anymore and decided to confront Barbara to finally find out how her mother could have betrayed her like that. Betty arrived at her mother's house, her heart pounding in her temples and her breathing becoming rapid. She still couldn't believe her life had turned into such chaos. As she approached the door, she paused for a moment, but then with a sigh, she knocked. Barbara opened the door and surprise was written all over her face. She looked beautiful as always, but this time it wasn't admirable. "Betty, are you here?" she asked, though her tone was rather cold. "Yes, I came. We need to talk," Betty pronounced, not intending to hide her feelings. Barbara stepped aside and her daughter entered the house. The atmosphere was tense. Betty could feel the anger boiling up inside her, while Barbara seemed to remain calm. "Can you please explain to me how you could have cheated on me with Alex?" Betty asked, trying not to raise her voice even though everything was boiling inside. "Betty, I wasn't going to keep it from you. You know how you acted," Barbara began, her voice sounding quite confident. "What, are you saying it's all my fault? I'm the one who drove you to this?" Betty exclaimed, her anger exploding. "You know yourself that your behavior has been intolerable. All you did was complain and make scenes, and when I saw him suffering, I just..." "Just what?" "You just took advantage of the situation to make yourself feel young and desirable." Betty interrupted her, unable to hold back her tears. "I just gave him what he needed. He needed support and you didn't give it," Barbara said defiantly. "So you decided to take my boyfriend away from me to regain your youth? How could you?" Betty shouted, her voice shaking with anger. "I have no desire to have a relationship with him. There's nothing between us, just sex. But it's your own fault for losing him." Barbara finally lost her patience. "Sex? You make it sound so easy, like it doesn't matter." Her voice was like a scream, anger and frustration mixed into one storm. "It doesn't matter to you? But to him it does. You were only preoccupied with your own problems, and he found what he was looking for in me," Barbara continued to insist, as if not noticing how her words were penetrating her daughter's heart like sharp arrows. "You could never understand what it means to care for someone. All you ever thought about was yourself," Betty blurted out. Barbara remained silent, her eyes glittering with anger and incomprehension. At that moment both women realized that there was an irreparable crack between them that separated them not only by blood, but by spirit. "I don't need this companionship anymore. I can never forgive you," Betty uttered, and turned and walked away, leaving Barbara in complete silence. With each step toward the exit her heart was breaking more and more, and although she still felt anger, deep inside she realized that she had lost not only Alex, but also her mother, who had become her enemy.